this story is not about Napoleon. It's a story about Louis Napoleon, who was the son of Napoleon III. I just explained that. Napoleon II was Napoleon's son and didn't live for very long. Napoleon III was actual Napoleon's nephew, and Louis Napoleon is the son of Napoleon III. Some people call him Napoleon IV, some people call him the Prince Imperial. So, his dad, Napoleon III, interestingly, he was the first president of France and the last emperor, and it was that way round as well. So normally you might find a regime that goes from empire and king to democracy. France was the other way round. He'd been elected, then he failed to get re-elected, so then he seized power. And then he lost a war with the Prussians, like a 10-0 kind of defeat to the Prussians in 1870. So he went into exile. So Napoleon III, his son Louis Napoleon, they settle in Chislehurst in Bromley, which, if you know the UK, is not...
Where is that?
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of outskirts of London. It is not the most obvious place for exiled European royalty.
Did they live in luxury still in exile, or...?
Not particularly. I mean, they lived okay, not least because the European royals, even if they were recently manufactured dynasties, tended to stick together. They certainly didn't like the other regime in France, where royals don't fare very well, and the guillotine comes out. So they were somewhat supported, but they weren't living like they would have done in France when Napoleon III was emperor or president. The Bonapartists, there was still an active lobby in France that wanted to get these guys back, and they believed that Louis Napoleon might come back to France and help to restore La Gloire, have a suitably grand marriage, perhaps even to descendants of the British royalty and so forth. So, but he was a very martial sort. He didn't like hanging about, so he joined the British Army. Louis Napoleon IV, joins the British Army as a...
That's so ironic.
And you've got to think about his prospects for the future. It's a brave commanding officer that sends him into danger's way. You know, he was being discussed as a suitor for the daughter of Queen Victoria, Princess Beatrice. But, you know, many in Europe said, yeah, that'd be a good marriage, and then you go off and be Emperor of France, and Britain might be able to help that happen, and Europe would be better off for it. But it's very interesting. Sometimes charming young men can cajole normally sensible women around them into doing things they wouldn't normally do. And his mother and Queen Victoria personally intervened with the army to let him have a chance to go into active service. So, you know, the future Emperor of France sets off in excitement for the Zulu Wars, and he dies in a lowly lieutenant's uniform in service to the Queen Empress of India and England's Queen. He was obviously a French speaker. We assigned him a guy from the Channel Islands, a Guernseyman called Carey, who's been unjustly blamed in some of the history books for what happened. Carey tried to keep this headstrong young man away from danger and on the straight and narrow. But look, what can you do with a guy who has Napoleon's sword from Austerlitz, literally Napoleon I's sword, strapped to his side?
That's so sick.
Long story short, it was all Louis Napoleon's fault. Rushes ahead impatiently, ahead of even the other scouting group that we was with, takes a small group of men into disputed territory, not waiting for the rest of his men to catch up with them. Ostensibly, the way was clear. There's a kraal, little native settlements that they're in. They stopped to brew up some coffee, and they had these stabbing spears called assegais, the Zulus, and the Zulus, I'm sure they were bound to have firm views about the war, about the British and the war they were with. They might have had views about European royalty, but they certainly didn't appreciate who they were stabbing to death. I like very much that the Zulus, after this battle, sent word back to Britain that they would not have killed this man if they'd known who he was. And it was I thought it was right decent of them in circumstances. He was trying to kill them. And they wanted to emphasise, in their very martial sort, the Zulus at the time, they wanted to emphasise that all of this man's injuries were to his front. He never ran away, he never sought to retreat, all of his injuries were to his front, and he died bravely. But his funeral cortege must have been a dreadfully bleak affair. The Bonaparte household had been struck a mortal, and indeed, as it turned out, fatal blow. His mother was devastated, and Queen Victoria personally joined the funeral cortege. Later on, his mother had his body disinterred and placed alongside his father's at St Michael's Abbey, which is in Farnborough, which is now called the Imperial Chapel. And Farnborough is the place where we host our air show. So if people are ever listeners and viewers are ever in the UK for the air show, you can go and visit. And there were various manoeuvres to try and get other bits of the Bonaparte family into play, but they came to nothing. And I really think that the Bonapartism, which could have changed the fate of France and therefore much of Europe, died that day in that lowly kraal in the Zulu Wars. So point one lesson, easy one, I think. Sometimes no matter how hot-blooded you are, if those wiser than you say wait, you should wait.